So is that our guest submitted?
Yes, that's the first group in. Maybe there's some more join in the next few moments.
Fantastic.
We'll flag as and when people join.
Brilliant. All right. Well, I will kick off in that case. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CyberUp drop-in event. I'm Simon Fell. If you don't know me, I'm the MP for Barrow and Furness, but I'm also the chair of the all-party group for cybersecurity. And this is a timely event. In May, the Home Secretary announced that the Home Office would be exploring the reform of the Computer Misuse Act. The law's 31 years old, if I'm not wrong, but it's worth considering that 31 years. 31 years ago, less than 1% of the population used the internet at all. And in fact, 30 years ago to this month, Tim Berners-Lee created the first web server, which has led to the World Wide Web that we all use every single day. So the world was a very, very different place. And now we are almost entirely reliant on these digital technologies. So it's crucial that our legislation is kept up to date and reflects the environment that we're operating in now, and not that of as I say, 30 years ago. Doing so, won't just keep us safe and keep me and my constituents safe. It's just the right thing to do. And as the law currently stands, and this is what you'll hear from the good people at CyberUp, legitimate cybersecurity professionals, people who are working day in, day out in businesses who you bank with, who you transact with, who you shop from, face the risk of being criminalized for doing their jobs, for making sure that those systems are safe and that the bad guys can't get in and do things that we don't want them to be doing to those systems and with your data. So there is a time to reform this act, and I believe that time is now. But that's enough from me. We've got a great session ahead of us with a number of speakers. So we've got Kat Summer, who is the Head of Public Affairs at NCC Group and is the CyberUp Campaign representative. We've got Dan Card, who's the founder of the CV19 Volunteers, Dan Butcher, who's one of the members of the CV19 Volunteers, and Dr. John Child, who is the co-director of the Criminal Law Reform Now Network. I managed to get that right first go, so I did pretty well there. So we will be hearing from each of them in brief presentations, and there'll be opportunities for questions between those. Standard Zoom etiquette, please keep yourself on mute throughout if you're not speaking. If you do want to ask a question, if you can just indicate in the chat and we will take note of that, and I'll call you then during one of the question sessions. So I will be quiet and I'll hand over to Kat to kick us off.
Great, thanks very much, Simon. And you've really summarised the issues with the Act and why we're here today much better than I could, which will also help me keep to my 2 minutes. So the CyberUp Campaign, who have organised today's virtual drop-in session, is a coalition of cybersecurity companies, of trade associations, think tanks, academics and parliamentarians, all of whom believe that the Computer Misuse Act is outdated and needs reform to better reflect the cyber threat landscape and the technologies of the 21st century. The main challenge with the Act, as it was written 31 years ago, is that it criminalizes cyber activities on the basis of whether someone has had permission to access a computer or not. So the concept of unauthorized and authorized access, which was fine 31 years ago, when computers were far and few between, and it was perfectly possible for someone to write a piece of paper and say, I hereby allow you to access my computer. Nowadays, a lot of the cybersecurity activities and the cyber resilience work that the industry does quite often does require unauthorized access. And that unauthorized access happens for very good reasons. So reasons of identifying and flagging vulnerabilities, reasons of understanding who criminal actors are, and therefore being able to warn others not to fall victim to them. But as the law is written, nothing in the Act allows anyone to take into account what motivations people have to do these things. So by the very virtue of trying to prevent cybercrime, lots of cybersecurity professionals in the UK actually run the risk of being sent to prison for criminal actions, which is why the main reform that we'd like to see as the Home Office considers the various submissions that have been made to their call for information is to include better protections and defences for the UK's cyber defenders. And I think I've just managed to stick to my 2 minutes, which I'm very pleased about, and will hand over to the next speaker.
Thanks, Kat. I didn't doubt you for a second. That's an excellent introduction. So we're heading now to Dan Card, who is the founder of the CV19 Volunteers. Dan, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Daniel Card. I'm a cybersecurity consultancy owner and also the founder of the CV19 group that my colleague Dan is with me here today to represent. We have responded to various different things in real life from a professional perspective, like the WannaCry incident in 2017. And at the start of the pandemic, I sat there watching world events and I was like, we've had a major issue on our hands potentially with the threat of ransomware and the healthcare industry in the UK and beyond having such a weak security posture. So what started out as just me and a few friends saying we should do something resulted in us having thousands and thousands of volunteers. And what we did is we've been using our technical capabilities from a professional and our ethical hacker perspective to hunt the networks for the last year and a half in the UK to support our intelligence services, collaborate with them, looking for vulnerabilities before the criminals get to them. The challenge in this stuff is that by doing so and in the manners and techniques and tools we use, there's obviously, with the current Computer Misuse Act, there's huge risk and huge hesitation for people to go and, you know, A, find these things, B, report them. Reporting is a huge problem. And the current CMA really prohibits people's ability to actively defend. So Dan and I have been scouring the UK and collaborating with the intel services, and we pass intelligence on to try and avert disaster before it happens. The techniques we use to do that are hindered by the current CMA. So we had the opportunity, we were kindly donated a large volume of licensing from an industry vendor, but due to the CMA, we were unable to use it. So we had a massive opportunity to be able to look at the entire UK, and we've had to use various different means and methods to do that in a legal manner. So it's, in some instances, you see that the criminals have got a massive advantage. They can do whatever they want. And then the defenders, researchers, and professionals of the world are severely hindered in what they are allowed and not allowed to do. I mean, Public Health England signed off on the NCSC being able to look after their networks. That's unprecedented. So this stuff is real, and you know, it's a danger to our society and our way of being. So I think it's important that we have the right legal framework, not only to protect us from criminals, but also to protect our researchers, to protect our scientists, our skills in the UK, because we've got an amazing UK hacker community. Everyone seems to think that's a bad word. It's not. We've got really great hackers. We've got really great legal, well-meaning people doing research, but they are at risk. So that's why I think we should need to reform the current legislation. We've got one of our friends is currently under threat from the CMA as we speak. So that was for disclosing an open website, leaking information out to anyone on the internet, and they're now at risk. So there's a real challenge on our hands. Obviously, Dan helped me with the rest of the team in hunting these.
Yeah, and to echo Dan's comments there, we are hindered by what we can do exactly. So the technical steps that we can take are largely passive, so likening to reconnaissance as opposed to like active infiltration, as it were, from an ethical standpoint. So we are highly dependent on public data that already exists, that's out there, that's already available to people with malicious intent. And those with malicious intent have no issues with going out and doing active information gathering against the organizations that we're looking to protect. So we are hindered in that regard, and we could be much more effective if there were no risks to our own financial risks, and reducing the risk of prosecution if those were removed.
Great, thank you, Dan, and I apologise, second Dan, because I should have introduced you at the front of this.
No problem.
That is really helpful. We do have probably a minute or two for questions, so I don't know if any of our attendees have got anything they'd like to ask any of our speakers so far. Baroness Morgan, you've got your hand up.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for putting this on. And I must admit, this isn't a subject I know very much about, so very helpful. Two quick questions, I suppose. One is just what the view from government is about the reform of the Act. So if they're not keen, why are they not keen, or what are they saying? And secondly, I suppose, is it possible to distinguish between those hackers, and I take that last Daniel's point about hacking is not always a bad word, but is it possible to distinguish between hackers with good intentions and bad intentions in legislation?
Kat, do you want to pick up the point on where the government is at the moment?
Yes.
You might be best placed on that.
Yeah, I was struggling to come off mute there, the classic 2020 response to life. So the Home Office on the 11th of May launched a call for information on the Computer Misuse Act, with a view to then, gathering the submissions and developing legislative and policy options for reform. That call for information looked very much at whether the offences are adequate and fit for purpose in terms of how cybercrime has evolved over the last years, particularly with the onset of ransomware, but also included a chapter which we as the CyberUp Campaign were very thrilled about, looking at protections and looking at whether there are adequate protections written into the Act to cover legitimate cybersecurity activities. And as Dan outlined, our view is very much that there aren't any protections. On the point around intent and ability to distinguish intent, so the view that we take is that principally it is possible, because research of criminal offences and prosecutions under the CMA has shown that there are very distinctive motives for people to undertake offences under the Computer Misuse Act, which is a profit motive or financial motive, or revenge, or any other ill intent in that regard. And on the flip side, the fact that lots of public bodies now have vulnerability disclosure policies where they set out what they consider to be good faith activity by security researchers, similarly distills a number of themes of how good faith activity can be defined or categorized. So that looks at the manner in which activities were undertaken, in terms of were they proportionate, were they overly intrusive or not, what happened after someone found a vulnerability or found a flaw, how did they report that information, were they very careful not to cause any harm or any disruption to systems. So from that, while it is not legally defined or anecdotal at the moment, the evidence suggests that if thought was given to it in the right way, it's perfectly possible to distinguish between an ill-intentioned malicious actor and a well-meaning good faith cybersecurity professional.
Thank you, that's really helpful, thank you.
Thanks, Kat. And one of the Dans, do you want to answer the point on ethical hacking?
Yep. Can you just repeat that? Sorry.
Baroness Morgan asked around ethical hacking and sort of how do you, I think I'm right, please step in, Nikki, if I'm
No,
going off.
I think Kat just also partly covered it. It was about whether you can draw a distinction between hacking for good, if I can put it like that. I think Kat used the word legitimate purposes, and those who clearly, and I think that's helpful to understand about the motive, the profit motive, the revenge motive, as opposed to presumably people who are doing this for better motives, can I put it like that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not very good with analogies, but bear with me. If you think about like neighborhood watch, people go and check car doors to see if the door's unlocked, right? And I believe that's legal, etc. Essentially, that's the technical comparison. It is like going and looking and checking and making sure the locks work, and if the door's ajar, then making sure there isn't a problem. It's quite obvious from a technical point of view, like what people's intent are, their impact, their actions, etc. You can see like there's significantly different activity that occurs from a criminal versus a security researcher in general. I think one of the areas in the Computer Misuse Act which is problematic as well is, like, for example, yesterday I downloaded a ransomware kit, which was the software that the criminals use to encrypt systems. So it builds their tools essentially. And there's stuff like that which is probably grey. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to try and say whether that was right in the right space or the wrong space according to the CMA. But I'd hazard a guess it's probably in the wrong space at the minute. And so some of the work we have to do, we have to infiltrate criminal forums. We have to understand how they work. We need to access their tooling. And this is from an industry professional development point of view. This isn't just out on the internet for fun. We have to learn how the criminals operate and how we can disrupt, deter, and react to them and make our country and our system safer. And without having that offensive knowledge, without understanding that criminal organization and all of the bits that make that criminal enterprise up, it's very difficult to defend against it. Hence the constant onslaught we get of, it seems daily, of an organization being ransomwared or having a fraud case committed against them. So we've really got there is an absolutely massive level, what we call technical debt. The level of system security in place in the world, in humanity's deployment of technology, is significantly weaker than people assume it is. And we've sort of thrown out technology in this fast and loose, quicker, cheaper, without really a thought about how it works and what the security impact is. And that's coming home to roost. So what we need to do is obviously, better equip ourselves as a human race and society to defend against that. And there needs to be a balance between, when we look at like crime and law, and then we look at like democracies and how we operate, this can't all be dealt with a strong-armed fist of the law. It doesn't work that way. Yeah. The technology and the internet and the way that this works, it needs to be appropriate and it needs to fit what's real, not what someone may think it is. Yeah. Crime will always exist, so it's like, how do we improve our safety? Essentially, I almost think of this stuff like quality assurance, and how do we, I compare what we do when we do it well to like how we design aircrafts. That's how we should be designing good computer systems, and we should be protected in doing so, and we should be able to, keep people safe. I mean, the bit that we said yesterday actually was, unfortunately, our friends in Ireland, the HSC recently got ransomware, but during the whole pandemic, I mean, Dan, myself, and my team at the CV19 Volunteers identified hundreds of ways to break into networks very easily. And the good news, I guess, is, touch wood, is that no NHS hospitals have been hit with ransomware if they have, it's to a significant impact point. So I believe the work we did, and I've had thank you from military intelligence services, people all over the world saying thanks for stuff that we've done. So yeah, I think that we need to do this as a society rather than as a want.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. Thanks, Simon.
No, pleasure. And yeah, it just shows how important the work you do is, and why we need to reform these laws to protect you, to keep us all safe. Now I'm doing some incredibly poor chairing here and allowing an interesting discussion to take place, but we're going way off topic. So we're meant to have a video, but I suggest we skip past that so we can hear from John Child. So John, if you're ready to unmute yourself and get going.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, thank you. So I'm Dr. John Child. I'm a reader in criminal law at the University of Birmingham, but I'm here principally as a co-director of a Reform Network, which is a grouping of legal experts, both academics and legal practitioners from across the country. And a bit like a sort of law commission type equivalent, I guess, but the idea of our grouping is that we commission groups of experts on particular legal topics to run projects on those topics through and then create reports. So our first major piece of work actually started in 2017, which was on the Computer Misuse Act. It was a project that ran for 3 years. We had over 35 contributors debating issues kind of across the piece until we came up with a single set of sort of agreed recommendations. So that was academics, lawyers, including CPS lawyers, charities, cyber professionals, both researchers and securities. We launched that actually in Westminster in 2020, hosted by Alex Chalk, and obviously with the CyberUp campaign with us at that stage as well. And that report's open access on our website, as well as an executive summary. Just in terms of a brief outline then, so I'll outline sort of our major concerns, and these are some of the things that have already come up in conversation, and then some of our headline recommendations. Actually, just picking up on the previous question, there are various ways, obviously legally, we can try and distinguish between so-called good actors and bad actors. We've made recommendations for where we should. I think the most important takeaway, though, is that there are legal mechanisms, and it should be about the choice between those. At the moment, you have a situation where there's no legal mechanism at all. So it's simply strict liability. If there's unauthorized access, that's a criminal offense. So at that point, as a cybersecurity professional, your choice is, do you take sort of vague reassurances from prosecutors that may be changeable over time? Do you take those risks with your staff, with your insurance, and so on and so on? So you end up stifling an industry because of such an informal mechanism about whether you are or are not going to be prosecuted. The reality is you're very unlikely to be. The statistics show that there's lots of these kind of offences happening, but very, very low prosecution rates, which is all very well, but not if you're trying to run a business which relies on providing these kind of services. So anyway, in terms of headline concerns, basically this is about outdated legislation. So world was a very, very different place, of course, 30 odd years ago. And it's led to a situation where the current statute is both over-inclusive in the sense that it's criminalizing people it shouldn't, and under-inclusive, where it was failing to criminalize actors that it should be. In terms of the under-inclusive aspects, those have gained some kind of attention, and there has been some piecemeal reform over the years. So reforms in both 2006 and then later in 2015 created new offences around trade in articles that could be used for hacking, which was an important sort of area to plug. It also created in 2016 some new aggravated offences, so those that gain access with intention to do further harms. And those seem broadly sensible. The one area we identified as a gap that's still remaining is probably in relation to corporate liability. So particularly where you have industries where they're encouraging bad practice, if you think large media organizations perhaps who are encouraging staff to find information for kind of dubious public interest, that if you had a mechanism that could better address that at the corporate liability stage. And we've recommended sort of a new offence of failure to prevent, as we see in various areas in relation to bribery and so on. So that would be a sort of a consistent approach then to corporate liability. In terms of the over-inclusiveness though, and that's obviously the focus of the CyberUp campaign, this is very, very clear that in the past you could have what is a pretty harsh offence in terms of this strict liability offence. If you think of unlawful access as a bit like the civil offence of trespass, it seems a pretty harsh offence. But of course, in the past, where this was a relatively isolated group of machines, you could say there was some justification for this heavy-handed approach. Nowadays, it's simply not the case. Computers are everywhere. Internet of Things mean that's sort of growing exponentially. You also have problems with ideas of access and authorization, which in the past, as Kat was saying, could be much clearer. Nowadays is much less clear. both in terms of securities work, but also in terms of, for example, employees of companies where their companies monitor their computers, or they have virtual presence from their computers, and that might lead to some access of their computers as part of that process for securities, banking, and so on and so on. So that idea of authorization and exactly what is and is not authorized becomes much more of a difficult line to tread as well. So in terms of our headline recommendations and the way forwards here is on the offensive side, as I've already mentioned, but principally on the defensive side, you have various options. So you could simply cut the simple authorization offenses. We see this in some European countries where essentially they have offenses that we would think of as aggravated. So you're only liable if you make unlawful access with intention to do something else, with intention to cause harm, with intention, and so on. We think that that is possible, but we think that might be a bit going too far in the opposite direction. There are times when showing ill intent is very difficult to demonstrate, and so offences of simple unauthorised access will in some situations be important and useful for prosecutors. So therefore that takes us into the realm of defences. And the most appropriate one that we see in this area is one that is still difficult for defendants to demonstrate, but we think a necessary safeguard, which is essentially a public interest offence, as we see in other areas. So the most obvious comparison would be in data protection, for example. So you have overlapping data protection offences. 2018 statute creates a public interest offence. We see similar things going on now from the Law Commission in relation to official secrets and so on. Again, this use of public interest offences. Now, the reason why public interest offences are useful and would be appropriate here, we think, is firstly, the defendant must believe that there's a public interest in what they're doing, which would cut out a lot of bad actors immediately. Equally important, the court must be convinced that this was in the public interest in fact. So if you have somebody who sort of Robin Hood thinks that they're doing the right thing when everyone around them would agree they're not, then again, that would not satisfy this defence. And equally importantly, the legal burden is shifted to the defendant. So it's for the defendant to demonstrate to the court's satisfaction that what they're doing was in the public interest, in fact. So it creates a heavy burden on the defendant, but the discussion around prosecution, the discussion around potential liabilities, all becomes about what is in the public interest, not that sort of shady, what can we do and hope for the best in terms of prosecutions. Now that leads hopefully to better regulation, whether that's centralized legislation through secondary legislation, for example, in terms of codes of practice, whether that's better business code, internal codes of practice, particularly if you twin it with this idea of a corporate liability offense, which would focus on the company in terms of what they're doing with their own code of practice and so on. So that's a kind of snapshot. Sorry, I go on a bit too much. As I say, very, very happy to follow up on this, either obviously in our materials, but also in person. I'm easy to find. Okay, thanks.
That's a very dangerous offer to make, John. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for John? Feel free to wave at me or pop your hand up in the chat if all right, go on. Everyone's nice and quiet, so I'll go with one. So, what do you think would be the legislative change that they can make that would make the biggest difference to cyber defenders?
So as I say, it's the need for a defence. So at the moment, as I say, you've got the situation where you probably won't be prosecuted if you're a good actor. Indeed, most cyber defenders are working with public agencies and reporting directly to public agencies. But there's always going to be a real disincentive as an organisation to offer certain services that may well be offered from other industries in other countries and so on with different legal regimes. Because what you're doing, even though you're one of the good guys and you're doing it in the full light of the public sector, you're still committing criminal offences. And at the end of the day, that's individuals committing criminal offences with families and all the rest, that they don't want to go into that area. So creating a defence allows that conversation to happen about what it means to do good cybersecurity work. What does it mean to be an ethical hacker? What does it mean to be an ethical researcher? And we see this question incidentally being asked internationally. So members of our network quite recently have talked about tech firms in Japan in particular who are looking at exactly the same thing, looking at how they could craft defences for their cybersecurity professionals as well. So it's a conversation that's taken sort of internationally, it's taking everyone a bit of time to work up in terms of understanding that interaction between public and private sector, but it's absolutely essential. And in a country like ours, where people are reluctant to simply break the law under the hope that they're not going to be prosecuted, it's essential in order for that industry to work properly.
Thanks. Because I'm being greedy, I'm going to ask one more. Does this hurt the UK? So I don't mean in terms of our ability to protect ourselves necessarily, but more in terms of the industry and whether we can grow that. Do we see in countries where they have legislation that supports ethical hacking, more vibrant network of people who can go about their business, and is that hurting us in some way?
So Kat, you're probably best placed on this one, are you? I can basically nod along to a certain extent, and we see efforts in several countries, but I think Kat's quite well placed on this.
Very good dodge.
Yeah. So the argument that we would make is that yes, absolutely. The UK cybersecurity industry is already very successful, but there are elements of services it is currently reluctant or unable to offer, particularly around vulnerability research, around threat intelligence, which are growing commercial sectors that customers are demanding. A lot of that demand is being serviced from other locations. So from the US in particular, Israel is another international competitor that just has a better and more permissive legal regime. So the slightly glib answer is that there is a reason why companies like Shodan and Census that allow for the open internet to be scanned for vulnerabilities are headquartered in the US and not in the UK. And there is no UK equivalent to either of these companies for the reason that you wouldn't set up a company that will break the law, whereas that greater permissiveness it is available in the US. So I think that the brief answer is that yes, that there is a risk that it hurts the UK, particularly as the industry and the future of cyber evolves. It hurts it competitively internationally.
That's really interesting, thank you, and a helpful argument to deploy when we're making representations to change the Act as well. Thank you for that. Do any of our other attendees have any questions? Otherwise, I suggest we perhaps go back to the video which we skipped past before. Anyone waving at me or putting your hand up in the chat? I don't think I can see anyone. Okay, in which case, are we okay to run the video that we skipped past, please?
Yeah, let me just screen share.
Thank you.
As part of ensuring that we have the right tools and mechanisms to detect, disrupt, and deter our adversaries, I believe now is the right time to undertake a formal review of the Computer Misuse Act. And today, I am announcing that we will be launching a call for information on the Act this year. I urge you all to provide your open and honest views on ensuring that our legislation and powers continue to meet the challenges posed by threats in cyberspace.
Think back 30 years, back to 1990. In 1990, you were running Windows 3.0. You were playing with the Nintendo Entertainment System. And we were slowly gaining our first access to the internet. And at the same time, we saw the first attacks from cyber criminals. In Britain, To protect companies and citizens from this growing breed of crime, the British government introduced a Computer Misuse Act, which covered a range of offences, including computer hacking. Today, the average speed connection from our homes to internet is 64 megabytes per second or more. And if we are not online with our computers, we're online with the smartphones in every pocket. And at the same time, cybercriminals have completely changed the way they try to gain access to our data and to try to steal our money. Meanwhile, the security industry has been quick to adapt with new ways to keep us protected. Today, security researchers, some call them white hat hackers, will uncover new vulnerabilities to keep both companies and citizens safe from cyber attacks. But 30 years on, the law remains relatively unchanged. Many of these techniques will still leave security professionals vulnerable to prosecution. This impacts our ability to protect UK businesses. It also leaves United Kingdom at a disadvantage in the global market, and it could prevent the bright young British minds from joining our industry.
Thanks, Elena. That was helpful, if not vaguely terrifying. For our new joiners, I can spot there are some there, and for those who very kindly joined from the beginning of the session, just to let you know, the framework of this is a drop-in session. So we're essentially going to restart now and talk through some of the issues which we already have with the same speakers as before. So if you were here from the start, you may want to drop off at this point. But if you missed the beginning, it may be worth hanging on and hearing from some of our speakers. So I wonder now if I just go back to you, Kat, and perhaps you can just give us a refresher on the CyberUp campaign and what you're trying to achieve here.
Yes, absolutely. So the CyberUp campaign, for those who aren't aware already, is a coalition of cybersecurity companies, of trade associations representing greater parts of British industry, of academics, think tanks and parliamentarians who've all come together to campaign for the reform of the Computer Misuse Act to make sure that the future cybercrime legislation of the UK accurately reflects the technology and cyber threat landscape that we are faced with in the 21st century. The challenges of the Computer Misuse Act, beyond being 31 years old, and thus written at a time where, as Miko outlined in the videos, the technology we were playing with and we were interacting with were very different to what we see today, is that it is criminalizing actions on a very binary concept of either someone has permission to access a computer, access a system, or they don't. There are no allowances in the Act to take into account why someone might be doing that. So whether someone does it for a nefarious motive or malicious motive, like stealing money or attacking critical national infrastructure, or whether they do it for good reasons, such as identifying weaknesses, pointing them out and helping people to fix them before they become a real problem, doesn't really matter in the face of the law or in the eyes of the law. And while that was okay 31 years ago, when there were very few computers around, and it was quite simple for someone who owned a computer to say to someone else, I hereby authorize you to access my computer, signing a nice piece of paper. In the world today, where lots of cloud computing has come online, it's quite hard to identify who actually owns a computer. And lots of the tools and the techniques that the good guys do and need to do to stay ahead of the criminals mean that gaining that authorized access is increasingly difficult. just means that that binary distinction is no longer fit for purpose. And that's, you know, an academic point on one hand, but it also has really real consequences, in that everyone who undertakes or considers undertaking unauthorized access to identify security weaknesses, to warn others to not fall victim to cybercrime, makes a very conscious choice of whether they want to break the law and risk going to jail. So what we are campaigning for, particularly now that the Home Office is actively considering how to reform the Act, is to include protections for cybersecurity professionals, so that they can undertake what they're technically able to help prevent cybercrime, and not have to make that conscious choice of, can I afford legal action if someone does actually want to send me to jail?
Thank you. That's a really, really good summary. We have two Dans with us, and I think perhaps if we hear from them next. So Dan Card, who is the founder of the CV19 Volunteers, and Dan Butcher, who's one of the members. We hear from them now, and then perhaps we'll take questions from anyone who has them from Kat and the two Dans following that. So Dan's, over to you.
Oh, hi, I'm Dan Card. I'm a UK business owner, and I'm the founder of the Cyber Volunteers 19. Cyber Volunteers was set up at the start of the COVID pandemic in response to the reality that our healthcare systems are significantly vulnerable to attack. And we had what started as a few friends of mine, Dan included there. We had thousands of people come together to support the efforts to protect our healthcare services. Now, one of the things that we obviously have a huge challenge with is the work we do, and we do stuff in collaboration with our intelligence services, but the work we do currently with the CMA, it runs a lot of risk. So we, on one hand, are severely hampered, not only from an activity point of view, but also from an industry point of view in what we can do. We've been looking at the whole country's like internet security across all different sectors, and we're doing this in a way which is, we believe, in line with the Computer Misuse Act, but it means that we have to rely on third-party data sets. It means we can't do things at the pace we need to be able to do it. It means we're essentially hindered, not only in the discovery and research perspective, but we're also hindered from a point of view of sometimes we find things that we don't advise people on. So I'll give you an example of this. Currently, I know how to break into a system on the internet that's a public sector. And there's a risk that if I report that, then someone will come after me. So again, we don't really have the right legal framework to protect us from an industry or a personal perspective. And so that's really hampered some of the activities and the pace we've had. But on the other hand, I have to say we have had great success, right? So even with some hindering there, we still have to, we essentially hack the system so that we get the data we need via third parties and countries that don't have the same restrictions, which seems a bit mad for me. We're letting other people do things which we think, which are basically fine. It's like looking at someone's house essentially, or as I said in the previous session, it's like neighborhood watch, checking if your car's unlocked. We're currently prohibited from doing that on checking if the car's unlocked via the CMA, and that significantly hinders people's ability to defend from a community, from an intelligence services perspective, I imagine, and from an industry perspective. So there's a real need to enable not only the right legislation to defend and deter and go after the criminals, but there's also the point we need to be able to protect our protect our people, protect our researchers, and protect the next generation of cyber defender, because we want people being on the right side of the law, not the wrong side. If they're young and they come into this industry and they misstep, it's very easy at the minute for them to end up in a foul place. So we need to make sure we've got the right legislation. And then I'll pass over to Dan.
Yeah, and to add to what Dan said there, I think we are hindered greatly in terms of what we're able to do. for fear of both prosecution and the potential of fines. So in terms of what we're able to do currently, we are highly dependent on public third-party data gathered using passive means. So like you can liken that to reconnaissance, as opposed to the more effective means of active investigation. So kind of similar to infiltration, although not quite as scary sounding. So it is quite a risky prospect that, you know, if we overstep the mark, we could be on the wrong side of the law. And we do develop our own tools as well. So as to the letter of the CMA, that does leave us open to the potential of both unlimited fines and the potential, I think, for 10 years worth of jail time for something that is developed in good faith for the benefit of the organizations that we're trying to protect.
I think that's a really good point. Just to off the back of that, I suggest, like, I write stuff which I have to call randomware, and we do research against offensive tool sets and offensive security, and it's stuff we don't want people to use for bad, but they're tools. And at the minute, the CMA doesn't really cater for the intent. It's like, if you handle stuff that's used in a crime, then you're part of the crime, which leaves us in an interesting position at the minute, which is not good from an industry or personal perspective.
Thanks, Dan, and Dan. It does leave you in an interesting position, and thankfully the right side of prison at the moment, and hopefully we can get the law reform so you stay that way. Does anyone have any questions for Kat on the framework and the CMA more generally, or to either of the two Dans around what it's like to be a practitioner in this space at the moment? Feel free to wave at me or indicate in the chat if you do. In which case, I will take chair's privilege and ask you one. And so, Dan, I'm not sure which one of you is best placed to answer this, but the idea of you being volunteers is fascinating to me, and I'm just wondering what the impact of the pandemic was on how you operate and trying to recruit new volunteers. What's that look like for you?
I'm going to go with this one. So it's been interesting, really. I don't know of anyone that's done a volunteer cybersecurity. We kind of likened ourselves to cyber medics. It's interesting. A lot of the work we do is there's a large level of risk involved. So we've got this sort of funneling system and a vetting system because there's so many people that want to do things, but there's so much risk in doing so. So it's really, we took a really risk-averse approach to this. There is a very small team of people who are our research and active operations team, and then we have like threat intelligence and awareness, etc. So it all funnels out into stuff that people aren't going to be at risk of breaking the law on. And we've been really careful with like who. We do a lot of vetting. We make sure it's industry pros. This isn't have a go hero stuff. This is people who are essentially the people that are doing this for their jobs. We just do it in our spare time because we know how bad technology security is. So we've decided to use our skills not only to help ourselves from a career point of view, but also to help our fellow people.
Thank you. It is appreciated. Okay, if we don't have any more questions, and I think I will move us on to Dr. Child. Just to, if you don't mind, John, just to take us back through your presentation.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. So I'm Dr. John Child. I'm a reader in criminal law at the University of Birmingham, but I'm here principally as co-director of a network of legal experts, criminal law experts, academics and practitioners called the Criminal Law Reform Now Network. So This was a network. It's a little bit, the easiest way to think of it is probably something akin to a law commission, but rather than having a settled staff that stays the same, you create a network whereby for particular projects, you can bring people in with necessary expertise to work on those projects. So the first one we identified back in 2017, as luck would have it, was the Computer Misuse Act as an area that seemed ripe for reform. We had a 3-year project, 35 different contributors working on it, debating issues across various events until they came up with a single set of settled recommendations. So this was academics, lawyers, including CPS lawyers, charities, cyber professionals, both researchers and securities. The report was launched in 2020 in Westminster, hosted by Alex Chalk, and indeed with the CyberUp Campaign. That very extensive report is available open access on our website, as well as an executive summary. What I want to do just now is just do a couple of headlines in terms of areas of concern we had, echoing some of the discussion we've just had as well. And then in terms of our headline recommendations, of which I'm very happy to follow up with anyone after the event. As an academic, I'm also very easy to find online if anyone wants to ask any questions. So in terms of headline concerns, it was a pretty straightforward overview, which is we have very outdated legislation. So a statute in 1990 in terms of criminalizing misuse of computers would obviously had a certain idea of the world, which has changed pretty dramatically over the last 30 years. And that's led to legislation becoming both under-inclusive in the sense that it failed to criminalize people that it should be for certain actions, and also massively over-inclusive, which has been the focus of much of the presentations today in terms of criminalizing where it should not. On the under-inclusive side, we have seen piecemeal reform over the last years. So both in 2006 and then later in 2015, there were tweaks made to the Computer Misuse Act, creating a new offence in relation to the trade of certain articles that could be used for hacking, and equally aggravated offences where people had unauthorised access with intention to do harms or when they were causing serious harms, both of which seem broadly sensible. One gap that we've identified there where we've made recommendations is in terms of corporate liability. So at the moment, there isn't anything akin to a form of failure to prevent type offence when it comes to corporations where their employees are perhaps committing computer misuse offences. We think that is a necessary gap to fill, as we've seen in various areas of the law recently in terms of taxation, bribery, and so on and so on. And indeed, the Law Commission are working on corporate liability at the moment with this kind of idea on a broader scale. On the over-inclusive side, this is pretty easy to state, and this is the fact that we had an offence, particularly Section 1 of the Computer Misuse Act, which just says if you make unauthorised access, you have committed a criminal offence. There's no need for any kind of ill motives or anything like that. It's simply a strict liability offence on the basis of unauthorised access. Now, that's pretty harsh, even in 1990, if you think of it as akin to sort of a civil offence of trespass physically on someone's land. But nevertheless, it's justifiable because computers were something special and they were isolated in terms of where they were and how you access them. So you could have this quite draconian legislation, but in this limited field. Nowadays, of course, that field is far from limited. Computers are everywhere, and with the Internet of Things is growing exponentially. So that idea of having very strict offences, but in a limited field, simply is no longer the reality. And what you end up having now is a situation where not only are computers everywhere, but having an offence simply of unauthorised access becomes problematic and indeed harmful. It's problematic because the idea of what is authorised access is much more fluid than it used to be, where you have employees of your company and you're accessing for certain facilities in terms of when they're working from home, their computers, you see it with internet banking and so on. That idea of exactly what is permissible to access is much more tricky. And of course, with researchers, with cybersecurity professionals and so on, there is a need for good actors to make certain access, not least to the computers of potential cyber criminals, where we would want some fluidity to be able to protect those activities in a way that we see internationally. Very much in its infancy internationally, incidentally, as well. This is an ongoing debate in many countries around the world, but it's an area where there are solutions that can be made, and indeed, the securities professionals in this country can get that leg up to do that good work. In terms of what we recommend, so I've mentioned already on the offensive corporate liability, the headline on the defensive side Currently, there are no defences within the Computer Misuse Act. What we think pragmatically and would fit best within this jurisdiction would be a public interest offence. So you could simply scrap those offences that just talk about unauthorised access and just have aggravated offences, but we think that might leave gaps. It's very difficult to demonstrate poor intention sometimes, so you might want to still have that ability to catch any unauthorised access. But the conversation should then be about, why was that access gained without authorization? Was it done in the public interest or not? And the beauty of a public interest offence, as opposed to more traditional kind of belief or in consent type defences, is firstly, the defendant must believe that it's in the public interest. Secondly, and just as importantly, the court must believe objectively that this satisfies a public interest offence, which can draw upon codes of practice, either in secondary legislation or indeed within certain industries, if it was preferred to keep it as a private matter in terms of those codes of practice. And very, very importantly, the defendant has that burden of proof. So when we see these public interest defences, the most obvious equivalent would be, for example, within the Data Protection Act, where we see overlapping offences with computer misuse, where we have this public interest defence. It is for the defendant to prove on the balance of probabilities to satisfy the court that what they did was within the public interest. So what you end up having is shifting the conversation, rather than people like Dan and Kat doing the securities work under the hope and probably quite legitimate expectation that they won't be prosecuted. It's still a hope and a prayer, right? It's still the discretion of prosecutors that may well change. Rather than that, you have a legal regime where you say what is in the public interest. You either do that through secondary legislation, which can be kept up to date quite easily and not have this kind of lag that we see with the Computer Misuse Act, or you have recognised codes of practice within industries, supported then by a corporate liability offence, which monitors how effective those are. So there's a few choices there. There's obviously a lot more detail to it behind those headlines. But the point at the headline is that this is very possible legally. It's something we see in other areas of the law domestically, and we see similar debates internationally. And it really is the right time now, obviously, to make these changes. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Absolutely spot on. And I'm aware of time. We have 1 minute before we're due to close. So I just wonder if I take the opportunity to go around our speakers and just ask them for one takeaway that they can leave the parliamentarians who've joined us with. So Kat, if I go to you first, bear in mind we have 1 minute.
Yes,
no pressure.
I would just really make the point that it is a once in a generation opportunity to reform the Computer Misuse Act, to make sure that the reform proposals are future-proof, fit for purpose in the 21st century. And I think we all have a responsibility to help and support the Home Office team in understanding what is needed, why it is needed, and what the right framework will look like. So the plea from the CyberUp campaign, I think, is to get involved, to support the CyberUp campaign. We've got a number of asks that I think have been shared with everyone. But yeah, any further feedback or discussions, I'm always happy to answer them.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kat, and nice and short and punchy as well. Appreciate that. So Dan Butcher.
I think it's worth pointing out that organisations are generally have a very weak security posture. This is not something that's unique to the UK. It's worldwide, but within the UK, we have a dedicated set of security professionals willing to dedicate their own free time to improving the overall security posture. And currently the CMA puts them at risk, and that should be addressed to protect them from doing good.
Thank you. And Dan Card, sorry.
Yeah, cool. I'm going to echo that again, but we've got the opportunity here to enable the next generation of cyber defender to not be hamstrung like we are today. This is something that needs to last way beyond Dan and I's efforts and our friends and colleagues. This needs to balance the law and the legal response and what are deter and prosecute perspective, but also with our research and our innovation perspective. We need to have the best minds we've got working on these problems. We need to enable them to combat cybercrime, to be innovative, to do research, and to help not only the public, people, and corporations. This is the this works through our people. And if we don't enable our people from a UK perspective, we are going to hinder ourselves from industry, from commerce, from a skills, science and research perspective. So it covers everything. We need to make sure we get this right.
Thank you. And John, from you.
Yeah, excuse me if you hear my toddler shouting in the background. My last one is, I guess, to say it's been interesting in the last 3 years since we've been working on this project in terms of our network and then publishing it, is just how many jurisdictions internationally are tackling the same issue. So we've seen a number of our members being consulted now and on projects going on in Japan, in the US, in a few European states as well. And it's very much the case that at the moment, our cybersecurity industries are hampered, and indeed we see better placed regimes internationally which are problematic. But this is something that is rapidly changing. And actually announcing the review that has been made now was faster than many of us expected, but it's very, very welcome, because this is a chance to put the law right on a settled footing that becomes sort of future-proofed, and actually not only to allow our industry to develop as it should, but also to protect against other states catching up. So this is a chance for the UK actually to lead in very sensible law reform, which is broadly good for everybody. And actually, as we had a debate on whether we should reform the Act only a couple of months ago in the party parliamentary group, there's very few people arguing against it. It's mainly about getting that legal regime right. And we think the proposals we've made, obviously, we're in favour of, but it's a debate that we should be having now.
Thank you, and that's a very good sentiment to close on. The good people of the CyberUp campaign will no doubt be sending around the speaker's contact details, and also how you can best support the CyberUp campaign and get a good reform to the CMA through the process that the Home Office is kicking off. So look out for an email from them shortly. But it just leaves me to say thank you to Kat, to John, to Dan, and to Dan for your time, and to everyone else who has both attended and asked questions, but also just helped this event run all together. So thank you very much to you all, and thanks for joining, and that's it for now. Bye, everyone.